Forget the grand feasts you have seen in movies, the tables groaning under the weight of pastas and pizzas and bright, cheerful salads. Tonight, we are peeling back the skin of the world's most popular fruit to reveal the grim reality underneath. The tomato you slice into your salad today is a genetic anomaly, a tamed beast that has been beaten into submission by centuries of hunger and agricultural persistence. But for the vast majority of human history, this plant was not a welcomed guest in the kitchen. It was a pariah. It was a source of terror, a biological weapon, and a symbol of moral corruption. The story we are about to walk through is not a tale of culinary triumph. It is a chronicle of suspicion, chemical warfare, and the slow, grinding process of logistical acceptance. Before it was the base of your marinara, the tomato was known by a much darker name, the wolf peach. It was a fruit that promised not sustenance, but sickness. The truth about your daily bread is much grittier than you think, and the tomato's journey from a feared poison to a global staple is less of a fairy tale and more of a survival horror. So, settle in. We are going back to the beginning, before the sauce, before the slice, to a time when the red fruit was a warning sign in the garden. To understand the terror the tomato once inspired, you must first understand the family to which it belongs. In the botanical world, lineage is everything, and the tomato was born into a clan of assassins. It is a prominent member of the Solanaceae family, a sprawling and dangerous genetic line that includes some of the most notorious killers in the natural world. Its cousins are not the benign grains that built civilizations, like wheat or rice. Its cousins are the henbane, the datura, and the infamous Atropa belladonna, better known as deadly nightshade. When you look at a tomato plant, you are looking at an organism that shares its fundamental DNA with plants used to tip poison arrows and brew hallucinogenic tinctures. The family resemblance is not just cosmetic, it is chemical. The Solanaceae do not want to be eaten. While other plants evolved sweet nectars and soft fleshes to entice animals to spread their seeds, the ancestors of the tomato chose a different path. They chose violence. They evolved a sophisticated chemical defense system designed to wage war on the nervous system of any creature foolish enough to take a bite. The primary weapon in this biological arsenal is a class of compounds known as glycoalkaloids. In the tomato and its wild ancestors, the specific ammunition is called tomatine, a close chemical relative of solanine, the toxin found in the green skins of potatoes and the berries of the nightshade. These alkaloids are not passive barriers like a thorn or a hard shell. They are active agents of disruption. When an herbivore, whether a prehistoric megafauna or a modern grazing cow, ingests a plant rich in solanine or tomatine, the reaction is visceral and immediate. The bad news is that the toxin attacks the gastrointestinal tract first. It acts as a severe irritant, stripping the lining of the stomach and intestines. This is the plant's first line of defense, a chemical command to expel the invader. Within 2 hours of consumption, the victim experiences violent nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain that feels like burning coals. But the assault does not stop at the gut. If the dose is high enough, the alkaloids cross into the bloodstream and begin to dismantle the nervous system. The symptoms of solanine poisoning are terrifyingly specific. The victim begins to salivate excessively, a foaming at the mouth that signals the body's loss of control. Pupils dilate until the eyes are black pools, letting in too much light and distorting vision. Coordination fails. The legs give out. In severe cases, the toxins induce hallucinations, delirium, and convulsions. The heart rate becomes irregular, the pulse weakens, and eventually, the respiratory system simply forgets how to breathe. This is not an accident of nature. It is a calculated evolutionary strategy. The tomato plant, in its wild and ancient form, needed to protect its offspring. A fruit that is eaten before the seeds are viable is a wasted effort. So, the plant front-loaded its defenses. The highest concentration of these toxins is found in the leaves, the stems, and most importantly, the unripe green fruit. The plant is essentially holding a gun to the head of any predator, signaling that the price of dinner is death. Only when the seeds are fully mature, encased in their hard protective shells, does the fruit soften and the toxin levels drop, allowing for consumption and dispersal. For early humans encountering this plant in the wild, the message was clear. The smell of the vine alone, a pungent, bitter, musky odor released by the glandular hairs on the stem, was a warning. It smelled of poison because it was poison. The tomato was not designed to be a food source for apes or men. It was a weaponized organism, a survivor of the prehistoric wilderness that had learned to fight back against a hostile world. When we look at a tomato today, we see a salad ingredient. But if you strip away the millennia of selective breeding, you are left with a wolf in the garden, waiting for you to make a mistake. This was the organism that humanity decided, against all logic, to tame. To find the true ancestor of the modern tomato, we must leave the laboratory of chemical warfare and travel back in time to a landscape that is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. We are going to the spine of South America, to the pre-agricultural Andes Mountains, specifically the rugged, wind-swept regions of what is now Peru and Ecuador. It is here, clinging to the rocky soil of the coastal deserts and the lower slopes of the highlands, that the story of the tomato begins. But if you were walking through this terrain 5,000 years ago, you would not see anything resembling the heavy, red fruit that sits on your kitchen counter today. You would see a weed. The plant in question is known to botanists as Solanum pimpinellifolium. In the casual shorthand of modern geneticists and tomato breeders, it is referred to simply as the pimp. It is a scrappy, resilient vine that thrives in the kind of dirt that would kill a lesser plant. It does not need the pampering of a greenhouse or the regular watering of a garden hose. It is built for survival in a dry, hostile climate, and the fruit it produces is a testament to that harshness. Imagine, if you will, a berry the size of a blueberry or a currant. It is small, perfectly round, and bright red. But do not let the color fool you. This is not a sweet treat. If you were a prehistoric forager and you decided to pop one of these wild berries into your mouth, the experience would be jarring. The skin of the pimp is tough, designed to hold moisture in against the arid mountain air. It resists the tooth. When it finally gives way, it does not yield a rush of sugary juice. Instead, it offers a burst of gel and seeds that is aggressively sour. The flavor is thin, acidic, and bordering on bitter. It is the taste of a plant that is barely tolerating your existence. For the early humans living in this region, the tomato was not worth the effort. You could spend a day combing rocky ground for a handful of sour berries, hands sticky with that yellow-green sap, and still go to sleep hungry. There were better uses for your energy nearby, in sturdier crops that offered real fuel. So the wild tomato lingered at the margins, more weed than meal, left largely to birds and other opportunists. And it is here that the logistical genius of the plant reveals itself. The tomato did not need humans. It had already found a better transport system. The tiny size of the Solanum pimpinellifolium was perfectly calibrated for the beaks of wild birds. A bird could swallow the berry whole. The tough skin and the gelatinous coating around the seeds, the very things that make the fruit unpleasant for us, served a critical function. They protected the genetic material as it passed through the digestive tract of the avian carrier. The bird would eat the berry in the highlands of Peru, fly north, and deposit the seeds miles away, complete with a small packet of fertilizer. This is how the tomato moved. It was not carried in the woven baskets of human traders. It was not exchanged as a valuable commodity. It migrated slowly, season by season, hitching a ride in the guts of birds and the slow-moving digestive systems of giant tortoises. It crept northward, moving from the dry coasts of Peru through the humid forest of Ecuador and eventually making the long, slow journey towards Central America. It was a silent migration, a biological drift that took centuries, unnoticed by the civilizations rising and falling around it. The plant was waiting for a new environment, and more importantly, it was waiting for a culture that was desperate enough or creative enough to take a second look at the sour red weed. The migration of the wild vine eventually stalled in the rich, volcanic soils of Mesoamerica. It was here, amongst the complex agricultural systems of the Aztecs, that the tomato finally found a culture willing to overlook its defensive smell and its chemical warfare. But the plant that entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was not the same weed that had crept up from Peru. In the hands of these master agriculturists, the tomato underwent a profound physical transformation, a domestication process that would confuse European botanists for centuries to come. To understand what happened, you have to look at the language. The Nahuatl tongue is precise, and the Aztecs were taxonomists of the highest order. They had a word, tomatl, which roughly translates to the swelling fruit or fat water. But when they used this word, they were usually referring to a small, green, tart fruit wrapped in a papery husk. This is what we know today as the tomatillo. It was the staple souring agent of the region, safe, reliable, and deeply integrated into the diet. Then there was the newcomer, the red, naked fruit that had arrived from the south. It was related to the tomatl, but it was different. It was larger, sweeter, and lacked the protective husk. The Aztecs distinguished this fruit by adding a prefix, calling it the citomatl, or plump fruit with a navel. This linguistic nuance is important because when the Spanish arrived, they were not listening closely. They heard the word tomatl, stripped away the prefix, and applied it to the red fruit. This error in translation is why, for hundreds of years, European herbalists would conflate the green husk tomato with the red wolf peach, creating a botanical mess that took generations to untangle. Under Aztec care, the citomatl began to mutate. The tiny, round berries of the Andes were selectively bred into massive, bulbous shapes. These were not the smooth, spherical billiard balls you find in a modern supermarket. They were deeply ribbed, folded in on themselves like a gathered fabric. They were lumpy and irregular, often growing in fused clusters that looked less like a fruit and more like a benign tumor. They came in shades of yellow, orange, and a deep, bruised red. To the untrained eye, they looked volatile, as if they were swelling to the point of bursting. But why did the Aztecs bother to tame this difficult, water-heavy crop? The answer lies in the logistical reality of their daily diet. The foundation of Mesoamerican survival was maize, but corn, in its natural state, is nutritionally locked. To unlock its vitamins, the Aztecs processed it with alkaline lime, a chemical method known as nixtamalization. This process created the dough for tortillas and tamales, but it also had a side effect. It made the food incredibly dry. If you have ever tried to eat a thick, dry corn cake without water, you understand the problem. It saps the moisture from your mouth. It is heavy and dense. The Aztec diet required a lubricant, a source of moisture to make the daily ration of maize palatable. The zitomatl was the solution. It was essentially a biological water balloon, a packet of flavored liquid that could be mashed into the dry corn to make it swallowable. It was not the star of the show. It was a utility player. This necessity gave birth to the first true sauce, or, in the Spanish tongue, salsa. But you must banish the image of the jarred, liquid dip you know today. This was a grim and gritty preparation. The Aztec kitchen was dominated by the molcajete, a three-legged mortar carved from rough, black volcanic basalt. The cook would take dried chili peppers, hot, smoky, and brittle, and grind them against the stone. The friction of rock on rock would pulverize the skins and release the capsaicin oils. Into this dry, fiery powder, they would drop the raw cetomatl. The pestle would crush the flesh, breaking the cell walls and releasing the gel and juice. The result was not a liquid, but a coarse, textured mash. It was seasoned with salt and occasionally wild onions. This paste was spooned over the dry tortillas, providing the necessary moisture to get the meal down. It was a functional chemical mixture. The heat of the pepper to stimulate the appetite, the salt to preserve hydration, and the acid of the tomato to cut through the starchy heaviness of the corn. To the people of Tenochtitlan, the cetomatl was a gift from the gods, a vital component of a sophisticated cuisine. The markets were piled high with them, glowing like embers in the tropical sun. But the Europeans who were about to land on their shores did not see a culinary staple. They saw a nightshade. They saw a red, swelling fruit that looked suspiciously like the mandrake, the plant of witches and death. The Aztecs saw lunch. The Spanish saw a warning sign. And when the two cultures collided, the tomato would become a casualty of the conquest, stripped of its context and sent across the ocean to face a trial by superstition. When the Spanish conquistadors began the systematic looting of the New World, their eyes were trained on specific frequencies of value. They were looking for the shimmer of gold and the heavy, dull shine of silver. But they were also pragmatic merchants, scanning the biological landscape for commodities that could survive the brutal economics of the Atlantic crossing. This is where the concept of the Columbian exchange, often romanticized as a grand sharing of ingredients, hits the hard wall of logistical reality. It was not an open buffet. It was a filtered extraction, and the filter was durability. Consider the inventory of a returning galleon in the mid-16th century. The cargo hold was a dark, damp, and rat-infested wooden cavity that pitched and rolled for 3 endless months. To earn a spot in that hold, a product had to be tough. It had to be stable. This is why the early stars of the exchange were items like the cochineal beetle, dried and crushed into a powder that produced a red dye more vibrant than anything in Europe. It was why they loaded sack after sack of cacao beans, which were essentially stones until processed. They took vanilla pods, cured and leathery, which could sit in a box for a year without losing their potency. They took chili peppers, which could be dried in the sun until they were light, imperishable husks. The tomato, by contrast, was a logistical nightmare. It was the antithesis of a trade good. In its raw form, the cetomatl is a fragile membrane holding back a chaotic slurry of water and enzymes. It has a shelf life measured in days, not months. Imagine trying to transport a crate of ripe heirloom tomatoes across the equator in a wooden ship with no refrigeration. Within a week, the heat of the hold would trigger the fermentation process. The skins would split. The white mold would set in. By the time the ship reached the Azores, let alone Seville, the cargo would have reduced itself to a leaking, putrid sludge that smelled of vinegar and rot. It was a biological impossibility. Because of this physical fragility, the tomato was never intended to be a cash crop. There are no records of Spanish captains frantically loading crates of love apples to sell at the markets of Madrid. It was a low-priority passenger. It likely arrived in Europe by accident, or at best, as a casual afterthought. A handful of dried seeds, perhaps scraped onto a piece of cloth, or carried in the pocket of a curious botanist, were the only vectors for its migration. It did not arrive with the fanfare of tobacco, or the immediate economic impact of the potato. It arrived as a packet of dust. When these seeds finally reached the docks of Seville, the entry point for all goods from the Indies, they were not greeted with culinary excitement. They were processed by the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, which catalogued every ounce of plunder. But the clerks did not list the tomato as food. It was categorized as a botanical curiosity, a specimen to be studied rather than eaten. It was sent not to the kitchens of the royal palace, but to the quiet, dusty gardens of herbalists and apothecaries. This is a critical distinction. The tomato did not enter Europe through the front door of the dining room. It slipped in through the side door of the laboratory. It was planted in pots, not fields. It was watered by men who were looking for medicinal properties, men who spent their days reading ancient Greek texts and trying to fit new discoveries into old frameworks. In the warm Mediterranean sun of southern Spain, the vines grew aggressively, climbing trellises and producing their bright, lobed fruits. But for decades they remained there, trapped in the garden. They were admired for their aesthetic beauty. The contrast of the dark green leaves against the vibrant red and yellow fruit was striking, but they were treated with the same caution one might give to a poisonous snake in a glass cage. The tomato's entry into the old world was quiet. No banquets, no recipes. For most people, it simply did not exist, except as a rumor from behind the walls of botanical gardens. To understand why the tomato languished in European gardens for centuries, admired for its beauty but terrified for its chemistry, you have to step inside the mind of a 16th century intellectual. The scientific method, as you know it, the process of observation, hypothesis, and experimentation, did not exist in the way we practice it today. Knowledge was not something you discovered by looking at the world. Knowledge was something you retrieved from the past. The ultimate authority on all matters of botany and medicine was not the plant growing in the dirt, but the words written on the page. And the man who wrote the words was Galen. Galen of Pergamon was a Greek physician who lived in the 2nd century AD, and for more than 1,000 years his writings were the absolute, unquestionable law of European medicine. His texts were the lens through which every doctor, herbalist, and botanist viewed the natural world. If a plant had medicinal value, Galen had listed it. If a fruit was safe to eat, Galen had described it. The intellectual framework of the Renaissance was built on the belief that the ancients knew everything, and that the job of a modern scholar was simply to interpret their wisdom correctly. There was no room for newness, there was only rediscovery. This dogmatic reliance on ancient texts created a profound crisis when the ships began returning from the New World. Suddenly, the docks of Seville and Lisbon were piling up with organisms that Galen had never seen. There were potatoes, maize, chilies, and tomatoes. These were alien life forms that had evolved in complete isolation from the Mediterranean ecosystem. They did not appear in the Bible, and they certainly did not appear in the Greek medical texts. For the European botanist, this was a source of deep anxiety. A plant without a classical reference was a plant without a soul. It was unclassified, unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. The scholars of the era were desperate to force these new discoveries into the old boxes. They scrambled to find vague descriptions in Galen's work that could be twisted to fit the strange red fruit from the Americas. They needed a name, and more importantly, they needed a precedent. They looked at the tomato, at its ribbed, swelling shape, its yellow-red skin, and its pungent, musky odor, and they began to flip through the dusty pages of the Materia Medica. They were looking for a match, something that shared the tomato's obvious connection to the nightshade family, something that signaled danger. They found their answer in a short, obscure passage where Galen described a plant from Egypt. He called it the Lycopersicon. In the original Greek, the word is a compound of lykos, meaning wolf, and persicon, meaning peach. The wolf peach. Galen described this plant as having a strong, offensive smell and a yellow juice. He noted that it was used by shepherds not as food, but as a poison to kill the wolves that threatened their flocks. It was a biological weapon, a bait fruit that looked appealing but delivered a fatal dose of toxins to any predator that consumed it. It was a case of mistaken identity that would damn the tomato for generations. The plants Galen was describing was likely a completely different species, perhaps a variety of the real African nightshade or a desert melon. It certainly was not the Solanum lycopersicum of the Andes. But the description was close enough for the nervous botanists of the 1500s. The tomato had a strong, offensive smell. It produced a yellowish-red juice. It looked like it belonged in a witch's garden. The label stuck. The tomato was officially categorized as the lycopersicon. This was not just a matter of taxonomy. It was a death sentence for the plant's culinary reputation. Words have power, and names dictate how we interact with the world. By labeling the fruit the wolf peach, the scientists of the era were telling the public exactly what it was for. It was not a peach for men, it was a peach for wolves. It was a predator's fruit. The name implied that the tomato was a lure, a trap designed to trick the hungry into poisoning themselves. The linguistic drift made the situation even worse. As the name moved from Greek to Latin and then into the vernacular languages of Europe, the specific context of wolf-killing poison softened into a general aura of menace. The wolf peach became a symbol of deception. It was a fruit that looked like a peach, fleshy, round, and inviting, but which concealed the heart of a wolf. It was predatory. This aligned perfectly with the visual evidence. The tomato plant, with its dark, jagged leaves and its hairy, sticky stems, looked aggressive. It looked like the kind of plant that would hurt you. By forcing the tomato into Galen's shadow, the intellectual elite of Europe had constructed a psychological barrier that was almost impossible to break. They had validated the peasant's instinctive fear with the weight of academic authority. Why would anyone risk eating a fruit that the greatest doctor in history had identified as a wolf poison? To eat a tomato was not just a culinary risk, it was an act of intellectual rebellion. It was to ignore the wisdom of the ancients and to invite chaos into the body. And so, the tomato remained on the vine, rotting in the ornamental gardens, trapped by a name that belonged to a ghost. The timing of the tomato's arrival in Europe could not have been worse. It did not land in a vacuum of rational scientific inquiry. It landed in a continent that was setting itself on fire in a desperate attempt to purge the influence of the devil. The 16th and 17th centuries were the apex of the Great Witch Hunt, a period of mass hysteria where the fear of the supernatural was as palpable as the cold in winter. In this atmosphere, a new, strange plant with a bad smell and a connection to wolves was not just a botanical puzzle to be solved, it was evidence of a crime. To understand why a salad ingredient could be viewed as a tool of Satan, you have to look at the practical materials of folk magic. In the stories of the era, witches were said to use flying ointments, greasy pastes made from fat and crushed plants, blamed for delirium, visions, and the sensation of leaving your own body. The important detail is not the recipe, it is the reputation. European nightshades already lived at the center of fear, medicine, and rumor, and the tomato arrived wearing the same family resemblance. Into this chemical landscape dropped the tomato. To the suspicious eyes of a witch hunter or a pious peasant, the tomato plant looked damningly familiar. It possessed the same jagged, dark green leaves as the henbane. It had the same 5-petaled flower structure as the belladonna, and most critically, it bore a striking resemblance to the mandrake. The mandrake, or mandragora, was the superstar of medieval black magic. Its root was famous for bifurcating into 2 legs, resembling a small, distorted human figure. The folklore claimed that when pulled from the earth, the mandrake would scream with a sound that could kill a man. But it was the fruit of the mandrake that caused the problem for the tomato. The mandrake produces a small, yellow-red berry that looks almost exactly like the early, heritage varieties of the tomato. Visual association was a powerful force in the pre-modern mind. The doctrine of signatures held that a plant's physical appearance was a clue to its function. If the tomato looked like the mandrake, and the mandrake was used to summon demons and induce madness, then the tomato must also be a vessel of evil. It was guilty by association. The fact that the tomato vine had a pungent, narcotic smell only sealed the verdict. To have a tomato plant growing in your garden was to harbour the raw materials of the flying ointment. It was to suggest that you, too, might be dabbling in the dark arts of the nightshade. The fear went beyond just the visual. There was a genuine, sensory dread associated with the plant. People believed that the toxins were volatile, that they could leap from the skin of the fruit into the pores of the handler. There was a pervasive belief that merely smelling the fruit deeply could cause brain damage or moral decay. The wolf peach moniker returned to haunt the plants here as well. In a time when the fear of werewolves, lycanthropy, was often intertwined with witchcraft, the consumption of a wolf fruit was seen as a potential trigger for transformation. To eat the tomato was to invite the beast into your soul. This rejection was not just a matter of picky eating, it was a survival instinct against spiritual corruption. In a world where your neighbor could accuse you of consorting with the devil because your milk soured or your cow died, growing a strange, foreign nightshade was a liability. It was a risk that no sane person was willing to take. The tomato was left to grow wild in the ditches or kept strictly behind the high walls of botanical gardens, a prisoner of its own biology, waiting for the smoke of the witch trials to finally clear. If the tomato had a specific enemy, a singular human being responsible for its exile from the English-speaking table, that man was John Gerard. In the history of food, we often look for heroes, the chefs, the farmers, the innovators, but we rarely pause to examine the gatekeepers who slammed the doors shut. Gerard was the ultimate gatekeeper. In 1597, he published a massive leather-bound volume titled The Herbal, or Generale Historie of Plantes. It was not merely a book, it was the definitive encyclopedia of the natural world for the Elizabethan era. It was the search engine of the 16th century, the primary source of truth for every doctor, gardener, and aristocrat in England. And on page 346, Gerard put the tomato on trial and delivered a verdict from which it would not recover for 200 years. Gerard's condemnation of the plant was not based on a chemical analysis or a double-blind taste test. It was based on a visceral, sensory rejection. He looked at the tomato, but more importantly, he smelled it, and he hated what he found. In his description, which would be read and reread by generations of nervous eaters, he described the entire plant as having a rank and stinking savour. He did not mince words. To Gerard, the tomato vine did not smell like a garden, it smelled like corruption. If you have ever grown tomatoes yourself, you know exactly what he was talking about. This is the logistical reality of the nightshade that we often forget in the era of the sterilized supermarket. The tomato plant is covered in trichomes, tiny hair-like glandular structures that coat the stems and the leaves. These hairs are fragile biological ampules filled with volatile oils. When you brush against the vine, or when you reach in to harvest the fruit, these trichomes rupture. They release a sticky, yellow-green resin that clings to your skin. This resin is not subtle. It has a heavy, musky, distinctively green odour that is difficult to wash off. It smells dusty and bitter. To a modern nose, it smells like summer and fresh produce, but to a 16th century nose, trained to detect the sweet scents of roses or the clean smell of herbs, this heavy, clinging odour smelled like poison. It smelled like the swamp. Gerard took this olfactory evidence and extrapolated it to the fruit itself. He argued that a plant with such a foul-smelling vine could not possibly produce a healthy fruit. He wrote that the tomato yielded very little nourishment to the body and the same naught and corrupt. This word, corrupt, is heavy with meaning. In the medical framework of the time, foods were classified by humours: hot, cold, dry, and wet. A healthy diet was a balancing act. The tomato, with its watery interior and its slimy seed gel, was classified as cold and damp. In the English mind, cold and damp were the enemies of health. They were the conditions that caused rheumatism, melancholy, and a slowing of the blood. To eat a tomato was to introduce a damp chill into your stomach that would extinguish the digestive fire. Gerard warned that eating the fruit would lead to the same physical symptoms as eating the nightshade, a cooling of the body that was one step away from death. The tragedy of Gerard's influence is that he was a fraud. Modern historians know that the herbal was largely a plagiarism of an earlier work by the Belgian botanist Rembert Dodoens. Gerard had taken Dodoens' text, translated it, rearranged the order, and claimed the credit. But in his haste to steal the work, he introduced errors that muddied the waters even further. He correctly identified that the tomato was eaten in the hot countries of Spain and Italy, but he failed to understand that it was a New World crop. He assumed it was native to the Mediterranean or North Africa. This geographical confusion mattered. By framing the tomato as a fruit of the hot, passionate South, he reinforced the English suspicion of it. It was foreign. It was Catholic. It was something that the Spanish ate, and therefore it was suspect to the Protestant English constitution. Gerard admitted that he grew the plant in his own garden in London, but he made it clear that this was purely for pleasure and curiosity, not for the kitchen. He treated the tomato as an ornamental specimen, a love apple, to be admired for its bright red colour against the grey London sky, but never, under any circumstances, to be swallowed. Because of the immense popularity of the herbal, this view became the standard dogma of the British Empire. The book was carried on ships to the new colonies in North America. It sat on the shelves of the Puritan settlers in Massachusetts and the planters in Virginia. When they looked at the wild tomatoes growing in the New World, or the cultivated varieties brought by trade, they did not see a food source. They checked the book. And the book told them it was a stinking, corrupt, cold poison. Gerard's voice echoed through the centuries, creating a psychological blockade that was stronger than any tariff. He had successfully framed the tomato as a decorative poison, a plant that was safe to look at but deadly to taste. The rank and stinking savour, he described, became the definitive scent of the plant, overpowering the actual flavour of the fruit. For the next 200 years, the tomato in the English-speaking world would remain a prisoner of the garden, a beautiful red warning sign that signalled danger to anyone who knew their botany. The gate was shut, and it would take a different kind of chemistry and a different kind of metal to finally pry it open. In the great manor houses of England and France, a disturbing pattern appeared in the 18th century. A few wealthy diners tried tomatoes, then fell ill, sometimes fatally, and the story hardened into proof that the fruit itself was poison. What they were actually tasting was their tableware. Pewter was the prestige material of the period, a silver-grey alloy cast into plates, tankards and spoons. But much of it was made with a significant percentage of lead, and the tomato, chemically speaking, is an acid bath. Its juice is loaded with citric and malic acids. When raw tomato sat on pewter, that acid quietly lifted lead from the surface and pulled it into the food. The symptoms that followed were vivid enough to seal the myth: severe abdominal colic, weakness and tremors. In some cases, the strange paralysis known as wrist drop. To a household trained by herbals and old medical theory, it looked exactly like a botanical poisoning, so the blame landed where it was easiest to place it, on the tomato. The class divide made the confusion worse. Peasants did not eat off pewter. They ate off wood or stale bread trenchers, materials that did not react. So you could watch the poor eat tomatoes without consequence, while the rich paid for their curiosity in cramps and collapse. The practical outcome was predictable. The tomato remained safe only as long as it stayed out of polite dining rooms, not because it could not be eaten, but because the wrong metal was doing the killing. While the aristocracy of Northern Europe was busy poisoning itself with lead plates and debating the theology of the nightshade, a different story was unfolding south of the Pyrenees. In Spain, and in the Spanish-controlled territories of Naples, the approach to the tomato was defined not by fear, but by a ruthless kind of pragmatism. The Spanish kitchen was a place of high heat, olive oil, and sharp knives, a laboratory where dangerous ingredients were not banned, but broken down until they submitted to the will of the cook. It was here, in the heat of the Mediterranean hearth, that the wolf peach was finally tamed. The breakthrough did not come from a botanist or a doctor. It came from the cooks who realized that the tomato was not a fruit to be eaten raw, like an apple or a pear. It was a vegetable that required the discipline of fire. The first recorded evidence of this culinary submission appears in a cookbook published in 1692 by Antonio Latini. Although Latini was working in Naples, he explicitly titled his recipe Salsa a la Spagnola, or Sauce in the Spanish Style. This title is a nod to the origin of the technique, a method that treated the tomato with the same aggressive preparation used for another suspicious nightshade, the eggplant. To understand this method, you have to visualize the 17th century kitchen. It is a dark, stone-walled room dominated by a massive open hearth. There are no delicate temperature dials. There is only the fire, the coals, and the ash. The recipe begins with a command that would have horrified an Englishman of the same era. You are instructed to take half a dozen ripe tomatoes and place them directly into the embers. You do not put them in a pan. You do not boil them in water. You lay them onto the glowing, grey-hot coals of the dying fire. This is the ember roast. It is a violent process. As the tomato sits on the coals, the intense, direct heat attacks the skin. The water inside the fruit boils instantly, creating steam that pushes against the tough outer membrane. The skin blisters, cracks, and eventually turns black. It chars. To the uninitiated, it looks like you are destroying the food. But this charring was the secret to the tomato's liberation. By burning the skin, the cooks were cauterizing the poison. They were destroying the tough, indigestible barrier that held the fruit together. Once the tomatoes were thoroughly blackened and slumped in the heat, they were raked out of the fire and left to cool. Then came the surgery. The cook would take the charred fruit and peel away the burnt skin. It would slip off easily, a papery black husk, leaving behind the soft, smoky, cooked flesh. This flesh was no longer the crisp, watery texture of a raw tomato. It was a soft, yielding pulp. It had been transformed. The pulp was then placed on a wooden board and minced finely with a knife. This was not a smooth puree. It was a rough, textured mash. To this, the Spanish cook added the aromatics that would define the flavor profile of the Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries. They added onions, minced just as fine as the tomato. They added chili peppers, a direct legacy of the Aztec salsa that had crossed the ocean with the seeds. They added fresh thyme, a distinctively European herb that bridged the gap between the old world and the new. But the final step was the most important. The mixture was dressed with salt, oil, and vinegar. This was not just for flavor, it was a chemical safeguard. The vinegar, with its sharp acidity, acted as a preservative and a palate cleanser, cutting through the cold and damp nature of the fruit that Gerard had warned about. The oil, rich and golden, coated the tongue and carried the flavor. The result was a sauce that was smoky, acidic, and savory. It was a condiment designed to be served alongside boiled meats, a way to add brightness to the heavy, grey diet of the era. This method worked because the Spanish were already experts at handling the eggplant, or aubergine. The eggplant is also a nightshade. It is also bitter if treated poorly. It also has a tough skin. The Spanish had learned from the Moors to roast the eggplant until it collapsed, to peel it, and to mix the flesh with oil and garlic. When the tomato arrived, they simply applied the eggplant logic to the new red fruit. They did not see a monster. They saw a variant of the aubergine that happened to be red and sour instead of purple and bitter. This mental shift was the key. By categorizing the tomato as a cooking vegetable rather than a dessert fruit, the Spanish bypassed the botanical stigma. They integrated it into the sofrito, the holy trinity of onions, garlic, and oil that forms the base of almost every Spanish stew. The tomato was chopped and fried slowly in the oil until it disintegrated, losing its shape and its identity, becoming nothing more than a red tint and a savory depth in the bottom of the pot. It was a stealth integration. The tomato was not the star of the plate, it was the foundation. And in this humble, hidden form, roasted by embers and dissolved in oil, the tomato began its slow, silent conquest of the European stomach, one kitchen at a time. While the cooks of Spain were slowly roasting the fear out of the tomato in their embers, the plant itself was finding a much faster, more efficient escape route from the stigma of the old world. It did not go east, across the Atlantic to the skeptical ports of London and Amsterdam. It went west. It hitched a ride on the most grueling, dangerous, and lucrative logistical network in human history, the Manila galleon trade. For 250 years, this was the heartbeat of the global economy. Once a year, a massive, creaking wooden ship would leave the port of Acapulco in Mexico, its hold heavy with silver mined from the Andes. It would catch the trade winds and drift across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, aiming for the Spanish colony of Manila in the Philippines. It was a journey of terrifying isolation. The voyage could take 4, 5, or even 6 months. The ships were floating cities of rot and disease, where the water turned green in the barrels and the biscuits crawled with weevils. But in this grim environment, the tomato found its perfect vector. The captains and the wealthy merchants on board were Spanish, men who might have carried the prejudices of Europe. But the crew, the men who actually sailed the ships, pulled the ropes and cooked the meals, were largely not. They were a mix of indigenous Mexicans and, crucially, Filipino sailors who had been pressed into service or hired for the return journey. These men did not read Galen. They did not care about the wolf peach or the poison apple. They cared about survival. In the months leading up to the departure from Acapulco, these sailors lived in the port city, eating the local food. By the late 16th century, the tomato was a cheap, abundant street food in Mexico. It was the food of the poor. The sailors ate it because it was there, and when the galleons finally pushed off from the dock, they brought the seeds with them. They were not carrying them as botanical specimens to be studied in a university. They were carrying them as provisions, or perhaps simply as dried remnants in their pockets, a taste of the solid ground they were leaving behind. When the galleons finally docked in Manila, battered by typhoons and smelling of salt and sickness, the tomato stepped off the boat and into a world that had no immunity to its charms. The Philippines was a tropical archipelago with a culinary palate that was already primed for the tomato. The local diet was defined by a love of sourness. The people cooked with vinegar, with unripe tamarind, with calamansi citrus. They understood that acidity was the key to preservation in a hot climate, and the key to making heavy, fatty foods palatable. The tomato, with its sharp, acidic gel and its savory flesh, fit perfectly into this flavor profile. It was not seen as a foreign invader or a poisonous nightshade. It was seen as a new, red variant of the sour fruits they already loved. The locals adopted the Nahuatl word tomatl, softening the hard Aztec edges into the smoother Tagalog word camatis. There was no translation error here, no drift into wolves or peaches. It was simply camatis, a fruit that grew easily in the volcanic soil of the islands, thriving in the humidity that would have rotted a European wheat crop. The integration was rapid and total. The tomato became the backbone of the guisado, the fundamental sauté that starts almost every Filipino dish. The cook would take garlic, onions, and chopped camatis and fry them in oil until they broke down into a fragrant, savory base. This was the sofrito technique of Spain, but stripped of its European caution and married to the bold, funky flavors of Southeast Asia. It found its way into sinigang, the iconic sour soup of the region. Traditionally soured with tamarind, the soup welcomed the tomato as a companion ingredient, adding a layer of umami and a brightness that balanced the richness of the pork or fish. It was used to make dipping sauces, mixed with fish paste and chili, creating a condiment that was essentially a maritime cousin of the Aztec salsa. Crucially, because Manila was the great trading hub of Asia, the tomato did not stay put. The port was teeming with Chinese merchants from Fujian, Japanese traders, and sailors from the Malay archipelago. They saw the camatis growing in the gardens of the walled city of Intramuros. They ate the stews in the markets, and unlike the Europeans, who asked, "Is it poison?" these pragmatic traders asked, "Does it grow fast?" and "Does it taste good?" The answer to both was yes. The seeds were carried north on the junks and the trading vessels, slipping into the ports of Canton and Nagasaki, not as a feared biological weapon, but as a curiosity from the barbarians in Manila. This was the back door. While Northern Europe was still paralyzed by the fear of the lead plate and the witch's ointment, the tomato was quietly conquering the culinary landscape of Asia. Island by island, bowl by bowl, carried by the invisible hands of sailors who just wanted something sour to eat with their rice. When the tomato finally crossed the South China Sea, carried in the holds of Portuguese merchant ships or the returning junks of Fujianese traders, it arrived in a civilization that was obsessed with categorization. The scholars of the Ming dynasty were not burdened by the ghost of Galen. They did not have a copy of the Materia Medica telling them to fear the wolf. But they did have a deep, ancient understanding of botany, and when they looked at this new, red fruit from the West, they needed to place it within their own framework of the natural world. They needed a name that explained what this object was, and more importantly, where it belonged in the hierarchy of plants. They looked at the vine. They saw the broad green leaves and the purple-tinged stems. They saw the five-pointed star of the flower, and they recognized the family immediately. To the Chinese eye, this was clearly a relative of the qi, the eggplant. The eggplant had been a staple of the Chinese diet for centuries, a trusted vegetable that was braised, steamed, and stir-fried in every province. The tomato was obviously a cousin. It had the same structure, the same growth pattern, and in its unripe state, the same bitterness. But it was different. It was red. It was full of juice, and it came from the hands of the strange, pale men who arrived on the tall ships from the great oceans. So, the scholars applied the standard linguistic formula for foreign imports. They took the word for eggplant, qi, and they added the prefix fan. In the lexicon of the era, fan meant foreign, but it carried a specific connotation. It meant barbarian. It referred to the wild, uncivilized tribes that lived beyond the borders of the Middle Kingdom. Thus, the tomato was christened the fan qi, the barbarian eggplant. This name was not an insult. It was a dossier. It told the consumer exactly what they were dealing with. It was a plant that behaved like an eggplant. It grew on a bush. It had seeds. It needed heat. But it had the wild, unpredictable character of the foreign lands. It was a precise, logical label that stripped away the mystery. There were no wolves here. There were only vegetables from the edge of the world. In other regions, The naming convention took a softer, more poetic turn. As the fruit spread inland, away from the rough ports of the coast, people began to associate it not with the savory eggplant, but with the sweet, decorative fruits of the autumn harvest. They looked at the bright red skin, the glossy sheen, and the heavy, hanging shape, and they saw a mirror of the persimmon. The persimmon was a symbol of joy and good fortune. So, the tomato became the Shi Hong Shi, the Western red persimmon. This name softened the plant's reputation even further. A barbarian eggplant sounds functional, perhaps a bit coarse, but a Western red persimmon sounds like a jewel. It sounds like something you would place in a porcelain bowl to admire while you drank tea. And for a long time, that is exactly what the Chinese did. Just as in Europe, the tomato in China began its life as an ornamental curiosity. It was planted in the gardens of the elite, known as the Pavilion of the Crimson Mist, where it was prized for its ability to hold its color long into the fading light of autumn. The poets of the late Ming period wrote verses about the strange, glowing fruit that hung like lanterns in the green foliage. They admired it for its aesthetic value, treating it as a flower that happened to be heavy. There was no fear of touching it, no panic about flying ointments or demonic possession. The Chinese pragmatism regarding the nightshade family was robust. They knew that many plants were poisonous, but they also knew that poison was often a matter of preparation. The transition from the garden to the wok was slow, beginning in the southern coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, where the exposure to foreign habits was highest. Here, the eggplant logic finally took over. If the plant was a barbarian eggplant, then surely it should be cooked like one. The Cantonese cooks, masters of texture and freshness, began to experiment. They did not roast it in embers like the Spanish. They sliced it and threw it into the high, searing heat of the wok. They discovered that the tomato, unlike the eggplant, did not hold its shape. Under the intense thermal shock of the stir-fry, the Western red persimmon collapsed. It released its juices, creating an instant, vibrant sauce that coated the other ingredients. It was sour, savory, and sweet all at once. It paired perfectly with the humble egg, another ingredient that needed a flavor partner. The barbarian eggplant had found its home, not as a feared invader, but as a pragmatic solution to a dry bowl of rice. While the Cantonese cooks were busy taming the barbarian eggplant in their woks, a similar but distinct evolution was taking place on the other side of the world. We must return to Europe, but not to the lead-poisoned dining rooms of the British aristocracy or the fearful gardens of the French herbalists. We are going to the Kingdom of Naples. In the 18th century, this chaotic, sun-drenched city was a political possession of the Spanish crown, and because of this colonial tether, the tomato arrived here early, carried on the same ships that brought the silver and the soldiers. But in Naples, the plant found something that it had not found in Seville or London or even in Tenochtitlan. It found the perfect dirt. To understand the tomato, you must understand the geology of Campania. Looming over the city of Naples is the brooding, shattered cone of Mount Vesuvius. We tend to think of volcanoes as destroyers, as the engines of Pompeii's doom. But in the long, slow rhythm of agriculture, a volcano is a creator. When Vesuvius erupts, it does not just spew fire. It rains down a mineral-rich ash that is loaded with potassium, phosphorus, and sulfur. Over thousands of years, this ash has settled and compacted into a soil that is dark, loose, and incredibly fertile. It is a soil that drains water instantly, but holds on to chemical nutrition like a sponge. When the tomato vines were planted in the shadow of the volcano, specifically in the valley of the Sarno River, they reacted to this luxury with a genetic explosion. The plant, which had been a scrappy, defensive weed in the Andes and a lumpy, water-heavy gourd in Mexico, began to change. It adapted to the intense Mediterranean heat and the mineral diet of the volcanic ash. It began to streamline itself. The result of this environmental pressure was the birth of a new cultivar, a biological machine designed for the sauce pot. It was named after the town where it was perfected, the San Marzano. If you are accustomed to the round, uniform, tennis ball tomatoes of the modern grocery store, the San Marzano is a confusing object. It does not look like a fruit, it looks like a weapon. It is elongated and cylindrical, ending in a distinct, pointed tip. It has a deep, blood-red color that seems almost unnatural in its intensity. But the true genius of the San Marzano is not on the outside, it is on the inside. This is where the logistical reality of Italian cuisine was defined. When you slice open a standard salad tomato, you are met with a complex, chaotic interior. There are multiple seed chambers, or locules, arranged in a spiral. There is a large amount of watery gel. If you try to cook this fruit, it releases a flood of liquid. You have to boil it for hours to get a sauce, and by the time the water is gone, the flavor is often muddy and overcooked. The San Marzano is different. It is a bilocular fruit. It has only 2 seed chambers running the length of the cylinder. This means there are fewer seeds to remove. More importantly, the ratio of flesh to water is heavily skewed. The walls of the San Marzano are thick, dense, and meaty. They are rich in pectin, the natural thickener that gives a sauce its body. When you throw a San Marzano into a hot pot, it does not dissolve into a soup. It collapses into a heavy velvet sludge. It creates a sauce that clings to the pasta rather than washing it clean. It is a fruit that was engineered, by nature and by peasant selection, to be preserved. The skin, too, is a marvel of logistical efficiency. It is thin and loosely attached to the flesh. When the tomato is blanched for a few seconds in boiling water, the skin slips off in a single clean sheet, leaving the meat intact. This characteristic was vital in an era before industrial canning machines. It allowed the families of Naples to process thousands of pounds of tomatoes by hand during the late summer harvest, peeling them and packing them into jars to survive the winter. It was here, in the volcanic soil of the Sarno Valley, that the tomato finally shed its identity as the wolf peach. The Neapolitans did not call it a poison. They called it the pomodoro, the golden apple, a name that hints that the first varieties to arrive were likely yellow before the red San Marzano took over. In this specific terroir, the fear of the nightshade was replaced by the necessity of the harvest. The tomato ceased to be a botanical curiosity and became a caloric necessity. It was no longer a question of whether it would kill you. The only question that mattered now was how many jars you could fill before the autumn rains arrived. To see the tomato truly conquer Europe, we must look away from the quiet, ordered gardens of the botanists and descend into the noise and filth of the street. Specifically, we must walk the crowded, sun-bleached stones of 18th century Naples. At this point in history, Naples was one of the most densely populated cities in the world, a chaotic hive of humanity that rivaled Paris and London for sheer scale. But unlike its northern counterparts, Naples was defined by a specific demographic phenomenon, the Lazzaroni. The Lazzaroni were the poorest of the poor. They were a massive underclass, numbering nearly 50,000 souls, who lived their entire lives outdoors. They had no homes, no kitchens, and no steady employment. They worked as casual porters, messengers, or beggars, sleeping in the doorways of churches or under the warm ventilation grates of the bakeries. They were named, grimly, after the biblical beggar Lazarus, the man who waited for crumbs at the rich man's table. And like Lazarus, their primary daily concern was the logistical challenge of securing enough calories to survive until the next sunrise. For the Lazzaroni, food was not a ritual of pleasure, it was a unit of fuel. And because they had no kitchens, they were entirely dependent on the street vendors who roamed the alleys with portable stoves balanced on their heads. The diet of the Neapolitan street was dominated by bread, but this was not the crusty, airy sourdough of the French bakery. It was a dense, chewy flatbread, cooked quickly in wood-fired ovens to keep the cost low. The problem with this bread, much like the Aztec maize, was that it was dry. To make it palatable, it needed a topping, a source of moisture and flavor. For centuries, the standard topping had been lard, rendered pork fat, and perhaps a clove of garlic or a pinch of salt. It was a white, greasy, heavy meal. It sat in the stomach like a stone. But in the late 1700s, the vendors began to introduce a new, cheaper alternative to the expensive fats and cheeses. They began to use the poison apple. The tomato was the perfect ingredient for the Lazzaroni economy. It was abundant, growing aggressively in the local volcanic soil. It was cheap because the wealthy elite still viewed it with suspicion and refused to buy it. And functionally, it was a revelation. When crushed onto the surface of a hot flatbread, the tomato released its acidic juice, cutting through the heavy, coating sensation of the lard. It provided moisture without the cost of olive oil. It provided flavor without the cost of spices. This was the birth of the pizza, but it was a far cry from the celebrated dish we know today. In the hands of the Lazzaroni, the early pizza was a grim, utilitarian object. It was a rough disc of dough, smeared with a chaotic red paste of crushed San Marzanos, usually including the seeds and the skins. It was often garnished with the cheapest items available, the heads of anchovies, a few cloves of raw garlic, or a dusting of oregano. It was not sliced. It was not served in a box. It was handed to the customer hot from the oven, folded in half and then in half again, a technique known as a portafolio, or wallet style, and eaten while walking. To the aristocratic travelers visiting Naples on their grand tour, this sight was horrifying. They recorded their observations in diaries and letters home, describing the Lazzaroni eating these red-stained rags with a mixture of fascination and disgust. They watched the street urchins consuming the wolf peach in massive quantities, juice running down their chins, and they waited for the poison to take effect. They expected to see the beggars seizing on the cobblestones, victims of the nightshade's toxicity or the lead poisoning that plagued the rich. But the Lazzaroni did not die. In fact, they seemed to thrive on this diet. The tomato, unbeknownst to the starving population, was providing a critical source of vitamins A and C, preventing the scurvy and malnutrition that ravaged other urban slums. The garlic acted as a mild antibiotic. The bread provided the carbohydrates for labor. It was a nutritionally complete survival ration, disguised as garbage. The sight of 50,000 people eating tomatoes every day without dying was a powerful empirical argument. It slowly eroded the fear. The sheer volume of consumption made it impossible to maintain the fiction that the plant was lethal. The tomato had not been accepted by the academy or the palace. It had been brute-forced into the culture by the sheer desperation of the hungry. It was the fuel of the urban proletariat, the gasoline of the street, long before it was ever allowed on a porcelain plate. The pizza was not a culinary invention. It was a logistical solution to poverty, a way to make the rejected fruit of the Americas keep the rejected people of Naples alive for one more day. The Lazzaroni of Naples had proven that the tomato was edible, and the Spanish cooks had proven it was delicious, but the fruit still faced one final, crushing enemy. It was an enemy that no amount of garlic or olive oil could defeat. That enemy was time. The tomato is a prisoner of the seasons. It is a biological solar panel that requires the intense, direct heat of the summer sun to produce its sugars. In the Mediterranean, the harvest window is brutally short. It begins in late July, peaks in August, and is effectively over by the first cool rains of late September. For the people of the 18th century, This created a feast or famine dynamic. During the harvest, tomatoes were everywhere. They were cheap, abundant, and rotting in piles on the street corners because there were simply too many of them to eat. But once the calendar turned to November, the red fruit vanished. The diet of the European winter returned to its grim, grey baseline: salted meats, root vegetables, and stale bread. The brightness, the acidity, and the vitamins of the tomato were a memory, locked away until the next solstice. The tomato could not become a true global staple as long as it was a temporary phenomenon. It needed to be made immortal. The man who would solve this problem was not a chef, nor was he a farmer. He was a polymath, a man whose mind was occupied with the deepest questions of life and death. His name was Lazzaro Spallanzani. Born in northern Italy in 1729, Spallanzani was a Catholic priest, a biologist, and a physiologist who spent his life teaching logic and metaphysics. He was the kind of restless intellect who studied the physics of skipping stones on water and the regeneration of worms. But his most important contribution to the kitchen came from his battle against a scientific theory known as spontaneous generation. In the 1700s, many scientists believed that life could arise from non-living matter. They believed that if you left a piece of meat out on the counter, the maggots that appeared were generated by the meat itself, created by a vegetative force within the flesh. Spallanzani did not accept this. He believed that the rot was caused by invisible invaders, microscopic life forms that existed in the air. To prove this, he designed an experiment that would inadvertently invent the modern food industry. Spallanzani took glass flasks and filled them with various organic soups, vegetable juices, meat broths, and mashed fruit pulps. He did not settle for a simple cork stopper, which is porous and allows air to pass. Instead, he used a flame to melt the glass necks of the flasks, fusing them shut into a perfect, airtight seal. This was the hermetic seal, a barrier that no air could breach. He then placed these sealed glass coffins into boiling water and cooked them for an hour. What he was doing, in modern terms, was sterilization. He was using heat to kill every living bacteria inside the flask, and the glass seal to prevent any new bacteria from entering. The results were absolute. While the open flasks in his laboratory turned cloudy, smelled putrid, and swarmed with microbial life within days, the sealed flasks remained clear. The broth inside them did not rot. It did not ferment. It sat there, suspended in a state of suspended animation, fresh as the day it was cooked. Spallanzani had figured out how to stop the clock. While Spallanzani was focused on the philosophical implications of his work, the practical implications were immediately seized upon by the pragmatists of the kitchen. The technology travelled from the laboratory to the factory. In France, a confectioner named Nicolas Appert applied Spallanzani's logic to food on a massive scale, replacing the fragile glass flasks with sturdy glass bottles sealed with wax and wire. And soon after, the glass was replaced by a new industrial vessel, the tin canister. The marriage of the San Marzano tomato and the tin can was the turning point in the history of the nightshade. The San Marzano, with its low water content and firm flesh, was physically designed for this process. It could withstand the violence of the boiling water bath without turning into mush. It could be peeled, packed into a tin with a pinch of salt and a leaf of basil, and sealed shut. Suddenly, the summer harvest of Naples was no longer a perishable commodity. It was a durable good. It could be stacked in a warehouse. It could be loaded onto a ship. It could be sent to the foggy, sunless cities of London and Manchester, where the people had never seen a tomato vine in their lives. This was the moment the tomato ceased to be a seasonal treat and became a utility. A can of tomatoes was a battery of stored solar energy. It allowed a cook in the depths of a Russian winter to open a metal lid and pour out the taste of the Italian August. It democratized flavor. It meant that the wolf peach, once the most feared plant in Europe, was now the most reliable ingredient in the pantry. It was safe, it was consistent, and thanks to Spallanzani's glass flasks, it was available 365 days a year. The fear of the poison was gone, replaced by the dull, comforting thud of a heavy tin hitting the kitchen counter. By the late 19th century, the tomato had survived the accusations of witchcraft, the slander of the herbalists, and the lead poisoning of the aristocracy. In the sun-drenched slums of Naples, it had become the fuel of the working class, consumed daily by thousands of lazzaroni who had no other choice. But to the rest of the world, and specifically to the wealthy elite of northern Italy, the tomato was still a suspicious, foreign object. It was the food of the South, and in the fractured political landscape of the era, the South was viewed as wild, dangerous, and uncivilized. To bridge this divide, the tomato needed a rebranding campaign. It needed an endorsement that was powerful enough to silence 300 years of fear. That endorsement arrived in the summer of 1889 in the form of a royal visit. King Umberto I and Queen Margherita of Savoy had travelled south to Naples, a city that had only recently been absorbed into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy. The royal couple was staying at the Capodimonte Palace, a sprawling hilltop estate that offered a safe distance from the chaotic, disease-ridden streets below. But while their bodies were safe, their palates were bored. For weeks, the royal kitchen had been serving the standard diplomatic menu of the 19th century: French hot cuisine. This meant heavy cream sauces, intricate aspics, and roasted game. It was the food of the international elite, safe and predictable. But Queen Margherita was tired of the endless parade of French butter. She wanted to taste the food of her new subjects. She wanted to know what the people in the alleys below the palace were actually eating. And so, in a move that was equal parts curiosity and political theatre, the royal household summoned a local craftsman to the palace kitchens. The man they called was Raffaele Esposito. He was not a chef in the traditional sense. He was a pizzaiolo, a maker of street food. He owned a modest tavern called Pizzeria Brandi. When he arrived at Capodimonte, he was tasked with a logistical challenge: to take the gutter food of the lazzaroni and refine it into something fit for a queen. He did not try to reinvent the wheel. Instead, he prepared 3 different pizzas, each representing a different facet of the Neapolitan tradition. The first was a pizza marinara, topped with tomato, garlic, and oil. This was the oldest and most traditional recipe, the staple of the fishermen. But it was pungent. The garlic was aggressive, perhaps too aggressive for a royal court. The second was a pizza topped with anchovies, another strong, salty flavour that risked offending the delicate constitution of the queen. But the third pizza was a calculated piece of culinary engineering. Esposito understood the political moment. Italy was a fragile, new nation, stitched together from warring states. It needed symbols of unity. And so, for his third creation, he looked to the colours of the new Italian flag: red, white, and green. For the red, he used the San Marzano tomato sauce, the blood of the South. For the white, he used mozzarella di bufala, the rich, fatty cheese made from the milk of the water buffaloes that grazed in the marshlands of Campania. And for the green, he added fresh leaves of sweet basil. This combination, tomato, mozzarella, and basil, was not entirely new. It had been eaten in Naples for decades, but by framing it as a patriotic gesture, Esposito elevated it from a snack to a symbol. He placed the pizza into the wood-fired oven, where the intense heat blistered the crust and melted the cheese. The chemistry of this specific pizza is worth noting. The San Marzano sauce provides a sharp, acidic base. The mozzarella provides a blanket of soothing, neutral fat. The basil provides a volatile, herbal aromatic that cuts through the richness. When Queen Margherita tasted it, the balance worked. The acidity of the tomato cleansed the palate, while the fat of the cheese provided satiety. It was comfortable, yet vibrant. It was the opposite of the heavy French stews she had been eating. The Queen was delighted. She sent a letter of commendation to Esposito, praising his pizza tricolore. Esposito, possessing the marketing instincts of a modern CEO, immediately renamed the dish Pizza Margherita in her honor. This was the turning point. The tomato had received the royal seal of approval. If the Queen of Italy could eat the wolf peach and survive, then the fear was officially baseless. The tomato sauce was no longer a sign of poverty. It was a badge of national identity. The red fruit of the Andes had finally become Italian. While the tomato was finding its soul in the wood-fired ovens of Naples, it was finding its price tag in the busy ports of New York. The United States in the late 19th century was a nation obsessed with two things: the rapid industrialization of its cities and the protection of its borders. But when it came to the wolf peach, the country remained deeply divided. The ghost of John Gerard and his stinking savor still haunted the American North. In the Puritan strongholds of New England, the tomato was still viewed with a lingering, ancestral suspicion. It was too red, too wet, and too foreign. It was something that belonged in the hot Catholic South, not on the sensible plates of Boston. But in the American South, the logic was different. The Civil War had shattered the Southern economy. The great plantations, once dedicated to the monoculture of cotton and tobacco, were broken. The soil was exhausted. The workforce was in flux. The landowners were desperate for a cash crop that grew fast, yielded high, and could be sold for hard currency in the hungry markets of the North. They found their answer in the tomato. The sandy, humid soils of Florida and the Carolinas were hostile to wheat, but they were a paradise for the nightshade. The southern farmers realized that they could plant tomatoes in the late winter, harvest them in the early spring, and ship them north by rail just as the snow was melting in Manhattan. This was the birth of truck farming, a logistical system designed to move perishable vitamins from the Sun Belt to the Rust Belt. But there was a catch. To survive the brutal, rattling journey on the steam trains, the tomatoes could not be ripe. A ripe San Marzano would turn into red soup before it reached Philadelphia. So, the American farmers invented the green wrap. They harvested the fruit while it was still rock-hard and bright green, wrapped it in paper, and packed it into wooden crates. These tomatoes were not food, they were cargo. They were durable, tasteless spheres of cellulose that would slowly turn a pale, sickly pink as they sat in the box. They tasted like nothing. They had the texture of a raw potato. But they were fresh produce in April, and the urban workers of the North bought them because they had no other choice. However, the Florida farmers had a problem. They were not the only ones who had realized that New Yorkers would pay for winter tomatoes. Just off the coast, in the warm waters of the Caribbean, the farmers of Bermuda, the Bahamas, and the West Indies were watching the same market. They had a geographical advantage, an endless summer. They could grow tomatoes year-round. And they had a logistical advantage, the steamship. A boat from Havana could reach New York Harbor faster and smoother than a train from rural Florida. By the 1880s, the docks of New York were flooded with Caribbean tomatoes. They were often better quality, riper, and cheaper than the domestic product. This did not sit well with the American agricultural lobby. In the Gilded Age, the solution to every economic problem was a tariff. The United States government was funded almost entirely by customs duties. There was no federal income tax yet. The tariff was the tool used to punish foreigners and protect domestic industry. The friction came to a head in Washington, D.C. with the passage of the Tariff Act of 1883. This was a massive, sprawling piece of legislation that assigned a specific tax rate to almost every object known to man, from steel rails to silk ribbons. The lobbyists for the vegetable growers had fought hard for a specific clause to protect their green wraps from the island competition. they succeeded in slapping a 10% tax on all imported vegetables. The logic was simple. If a crate of tomatoes from the West Indies cost $1, the importer would have to pay the government 10 cents. This margin would force them to raise their prices, making the Florida tomatoes competitive again. It was a classic protectionist move. But the Tariff Act contained a fatal flaw. In the section detailing the free list, the items that could be imported without any tax at all, there was a clear exemption for fruits, green, ripe, or dried. This legislative contradiction set the stage for a collision between biology and bureaucracy. The importers looked at the law, and then they looked at their botany textbooks. They knew that scientifically, the tomato was a fruit. It developed from the ovary of a flower. It contained seeds. By the rigid definitions of science, it belonged on the free list, right next to the bananas and the lemons. The customs collectors at the port of New York, however, looked at the law and saw a vegetable. They saw a savory item that competed with the American potato. They demanded the tax. This was not a trivial semantic argument. It was a question of millions of dollars. The importers, led by the Nix family, a powerful dynasty of produce merchants, decided to fight. They paid the taxes under protest, kept their receipts, and hired the best lawyers money could buy. They were going to prove, in a court of law, that the United States government did not know the difference between a fruit and a vegetable. The wolf peach was heading to the Supreme Court. On April 24, 1893, the case of Nix versus Hedden was finally called to the floor of the United States Supreme Court. The setting for this debate was the old Senate chamber, a room heavy with the scent of varnished mahogany and the dust of a century of legislation. It was a quiet, dimly lit space, insulated from the noise of the street by thick velvet curtains and stone walls. The 9 justices, led by Chief Justice Melville Fuller, sat in their black robes, prepared to hear arguments on the constitutionality of laws or the rights of states. Instead, they were asked to decide the biological identity of a salad ingredient. The plaintiff, John Nix, was not a farmer. He was a businessman, a veteran of the New York produce scene who understood the razor-thin margins of the perishable trade. He had paid the 10% duty on his Caribbean tomatoes under protest, and now he wanted his money back. His legal strategy was bold in its boredom. He did not intend to bring in chefs to cook for the judges. He did not intend to bring in farmers to testify about the soil. He intended to win the case by reading the dictionary. The counsel for the plaintiff approached the bench carrying 3 massive, leather-bound books. These were the heavy artillery of the Victorian intellect: Webster's Dictionary, Worcester's Dictionary, and the Imperial Dictionary. In the 19th century, the dictionary was more than a reference guide. It was the secular Bible of the English language. It was the final arbiter of reality. If a definition existed in Webster's, it was considered a fact as immutable as gravity. The lawyer opened the first volume. The pages were thin and crisp, rustling in the silence of the court. He began to read the definition of fruit. According to Webster, a fruit was the seed of plants, or that part of plants which contains the seed, and especially the juicy, pulpy parts of certain plants covering and enclosing the seed. He paused to let the definition settle in the air. He then turned to Worcester's. The definition was nearly identical: the ovary of a plant, the seed-bearing structure. This was the core of the plaintiff's argument. It was a plea for scientific precision over cultural habit. The lawyer argued that the law, being a precise instrument, must rely on the precise definitions of the natural world. He walked the justices through the life cycle of the tomato plant. He described the yellow, 5-pointed flower that blooms on the vine. He explained the mechanism of pollination, how the pistil receives the pollen and the ovary at the base of the flower begins to swell. He argued that biologically there is no ambiguity. In the eyes of a botanist, Any structure that develops from a flower and contains seeds is, by definition, a fruit. It is the delivery mechanism for the next generation. The tomato fits this description perfectly. It is a swollen ovary. It is filled with seeds suspended in a placental gel. It is, structurally speaking, identical to a peach, a pear, or a plum. The fact that it is not sweet is a culinary accident, not a biological one. Sugar content is not a requirement for fruit classification. The presence of seeds is. To reinforce this point, the plaintiff's counsel read the definition of vegetable. The dictionaries defined a vegetable in the broadest possible terms as a plant used for food. This definition was vague, it was inclusive, but the definition of fruit was specific. In the hierarchy of language, the specific must override the general. The tomato was technically a vegetable because it was a plant, but it was specifically a fruit because of its anatomy. Therefore, under the logic of the free list in the Tariff Act, which exempted fruits, green, ripe, or dried, the tomato must be free. The courtroom atmosphere was dry, defined by the scratching of pens and the turning of pages. The plaintiff called witnesses, 2 veteran sellers of fruit and vegetables who had worked the New York markets for 30 years. The lawyer asked them a single, carefully calibrated question. In the world of trade and commerce, did the words fruit and vegetable have any special, secret meaning that was different from the dictionary definition? The witnesses said no. They testified that a fruit was a fruit and a vegetable was a vegetable, just as the dictionary said. This was a trap. By confirming that there was no special trade language, the plaintiff forced the court to rely on the common meaning found in the books, and the books were on the side of the tomato. The plaintiff rested his case on this fortress of logic. He had proven, with the highest authorities in the English language, that the tomato was a seed-bearing structure. He had stripped the wolf peach of its culinary context, removing the olive oil, the salt, and the heat of the oven. He presented the tomato to the Supreme Court as a pure botanical object, a vessel of seeds that had been unfairly taxed by a government that refused to read its own reference books. It seemed like an unassailable argument. Science was on his side. The dictionary was on his side. But he had forgotten one thing. The Supreme Court does not eat dinner with a dictionary. The defense counsel for the government, representing the tax collector, William Hedden, did not attempt to fight the botanist on his own turf. He knew that if the argument remained in the microscopic realm of ovaries and pistils, the government would lose. The science was irrefutable. Instead, he shifted the battlefield from the laboratory to the kitchen. He did not call upon scientists. He called upon the common sense of the consumer. He picked up the same dictionaries that the plaintiff had used, but he turned to different pages. He read the definitions of other common produce items. He read the entry for cucumber. He read the entry for squash. He read the entry for pea and bean. In every single case, the dictionary admitted that these items were, botanically speaking, fruits. They were seed-bearing structures. And yet, in the tariff law, and in the minds of every shopper in New York, they were vegetables. The defense argued that if the court accepted the plaintiff's rigid botanical definition, the entire legal structure of the American grocery trade would collapse. If a tomato was a fruit because it had seeds, then a pickle was a fruit, a pepper was a fruit, a pod of okra was a fruit. The free list would suddenly expand to include half the contents of the vegetable aisle, and the government would lose millions in revenue. The law, he argued, was not written for botanists. It was written for merchants. It was written for the people who bought and sold these goods, and for the people who ate them. And in the language of the people, the common parlance, a tomato was a vegetable. On May 10, 1893, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. The opinion was written by Justice Horace Gray, a man known for his deep knowledge of legal precedent and his pragmatic view of statutory interpretation. In a unanimous decision, the court sided with the tax collector. The tomato was, legally and perpetually, a vegetable. Justice Gray's opinion is a fascinating document because it explicitly acknowledges the scientific truth before discarding it in favor of the social truth. He wrote, "Botanically speaking, tomatoes are the fruit of a vine, just as are cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas." He conceded the science entirely. The plaintiff was right about the biology. But, Justice Gray continued, in the common language of the people, all these are vegetables. The core of the ruling came down to the architecture of the Victorian meal. Justice Gray established a legal test based on the order of service at the dinner table. He noted that tomatoes are eaten cooked or raw, and are usually served at dinner in, with, or after the soup, fish, or meats, which constitute the principal part of the repast, and not, like fruits generally, as dessert. This was the defining line. The difference between a fruit and a vegetable was not determined by the presence of seeds, the structure of the vine, or the pollination method. It was determined by the presence of sugar and the timing of consumption. If you ate it with the roast beef, it was a vegetable. If you ate it with the cake, it was a fruit. The tomato, with its acidity and its savory profile, belonged to the savory courses. It was a companion to the potato, not the peach. Therefore, it must be taxed like a potato. This ruling was the final nail in the coffin of the wolf peach. The Supreme Court had legally severed the tomato from its biological reality. It was an act of judicial alchemy. By the stroke of a pen, the fruit of the vine was transmuted into the vegetable of the trade. The Nix family lost their case, the government kept its 10% tax, and the protectionist barrier around the American tomato industry held firm. The legacy of Nix versus Hedden extended far beyond the customs house. It codified the everyday, culinary definition of the tomato in American law, and it created the tidy, bureaucratic logic that later let ketchup masquerade as a vegetable in official programs. Now that the Supreme Court had decided the tomato was a vegetable, the path was cleared for it to become a commodity. But before it could become the thick, sweet, red paste we know today, it had to undergo a strange and pungent metamorphosis. It had to become ketchup. To understand the origins of this ubiquitous sauce, you must forget the red plastic bottle sitting in the door of your refrigerator. You must travel back to the humid, bustling ports of Fujian province in China, specifically to the docks where the Min dialect was spoken by the traders and the sailors. Here, in the 17th century, the word ketchup did not refer to a sauce made from a fruit. It referred to a brine of pickled fish. It was a preservation technique born of the sea, a way to monetize the waste of the catch. Fishermen would take the entrails of their fish, the guts, the bladders, the parts that could not be sold at market, and pack them into large earthenware jars with heavy layers of coarse salt. They would seal the jars and wait. Inside the dark ceramic vessels, a slow, controlled rot took place. The enzymes in the fish guts broke down the proteins, liquefying the solids into a thin, amber-colored fluid. This fluid was intensely salty, funky, and rich in savory compounds. It was a fish sauce, identical in spirit to the garum of ancient Rome or the nam pla of modern Thailand. It was a seasoning used to add depth to dry rice and bland vegetables, a way to inject the flavor of the ocean into the diet of the land. When British sailors encountered this sauce in the late 17th century, they were captivated by its utility. It was a shelf-stable flavor bomb that could survive the long, damp voyage home without spoiling. They brought casks of it back to London, but when the supply ran out, they hit a logistical wall. They could not replicate the specific fish of the South China Sea in the cold waters of the Atlantic. So, the British cooks began to improvise. They kept the name, anglicising the Min word ketchup to catchup or ketchup, but they changed the base ingredient entirely. For the next 100 years, ketchup in the English-speaking world was a dark, thin sauce made from mushrooms, walnuts, or oysters. It was not red. It was brown. It was watery. It was essentially a flavored soy sauce used to season soups and gravies. It was a condiment defined by its salt content, not its sugar. The tomato did not enter the equation until the early 19th century, and even then, it was a reluctant participant. The first recorded recipe for tomato ketchup appeared in Philadelphia in 1812, written by a scientist named James Mees. But this early tomato ketchup was a volatile substance. The tomato, unlike the walnut, is full of sugar and water. When you bottle it, the natural yeasts in the air begin to feast on that sugar. If you left a bottle of early tomato ketchup on a pantry shelf, it would not just sit there, it would live. The mixture would ferment. Carbon dioxide gas would build up inside the glass. It was not uncommon for a housewife to walk into her kitchen and find that her bottles of ketchup had exploded, spraying red shrapnel and sour juice across the room. To combat this, the makers had to rely on heavy-handed chemistry. They did not cook the sauce down to a paste. They fermented it intentionally, turning the sugars into alcohol and vinegar to kill the bacteria. The flavor of this pre-industrial ketchup was aggressive. It was sour, salty, and bitter. It had a thin, watery consistency. It was often fortified with spices like cloves, cayenne, and mace to hide the taste of the fermentation. But the most important ingredient in the 19th century bottle was not a spice. It was a preservative called sodium benzoate. Without the technology of sterilization that Spallanzani had pioneered, manufacturers relied on chemical additives to halt the rot. They pumped the sauce full of preservatives to keep it stable. This made the ketchup safe to store, but it gave it a harsh, medicinal aftertaste. It was a product that tasted of the laboratory, a suspension of tomato solids in a chemical brine. So why did people eat it? They ate it because of the meat. In the era before mechanical refrigeration, keeping meat fresh was a constant losing battle. A steak bought at the market in the morning might be turning grey and slick by dinner time. The pork chop might have the faint, sweet smell of early decay. The chicken might be tough and stringy. Ketchup was not a condiment for pleasure. It was a tool for sanitation. It was a masking agent. Its intense acidity and heavy spice profile were designed to cover up the taste of rancid fat and spoiling protein. You poured the thin, sour red sauce over your grey meat to trick your tongue into believing it was fresh. It was essentially a culinary lie, a way to make the unsafe palatable. The tomato had travelled from the poison of the nightshade to the poison of the preservative, serving as the grim, acidic guardian of the Victorian dinner plate. In the midst of this chemical arms race, where the safety of the dinner table was maintained by the aggressive use of coal tar dyes and sodium benzoate, a horseradish salesman from Pittsburgh decided to attempt a radical experiment. His name was Henry John Heinz, and he was a man possessed by a Victorian obsession with purity. He looked at the opaque brown bottles of his competitors, bottles that were deliberately tinted dark to hide the grey, oxidizing sludge inside, and he saw an opportunity for a moral victory. Heinz believed that the consumer had been lied to for so long that the truth itself could be a marketing strategy. He decided to manufacture a ketchup that contained no preservatives. He would banish the sodium benzoate. He would reject the chemical stabilizers. This was a significant logistical risk. Without the chemicals, the sauce was liable to spoil. To prevent this, Heinz had to alter the fundamental chemistry of the recipe. He stopped using the scraps and the unripe leftovers that other factories swept off the floor. Instead, he used fully ripe, red tomatoes. This was crucial because ripe tomatoes contain higher levels of natural pectin, a thickening agent. He then increased the volume of vinegar dramatically, raising the acidity of the sauce to a level where bacteria simply could not survive. He added sugar to balance the sourness and salt to cure the mixture. He cooked it down until the water evaporated, leaving behind a dense, concentrated paste. But the most important innovation was not the recipe, it was the vessel. To prove to the suspicious public that his ketchup was free of turnips, pumpkin pulp, and floor sweepings, Heinz designed a bottle made of clear, unblemished glass. He created a transparent architecture for his sauce. The bottle was fluted, with 8 distinct facets that caught the light, turning the red condiment into a glowing jewel. It was a display case. It forced the factory to maintain absolute hygiene because any impurity would be visible to the naked eye. However, this commitment to purity created a new problem, one rooted in the laws of physics. Because Heinz used ripe tomatoes rich in pectin and cooked them down to a heavy paste, the resulting fluid was incredibly viscous. It was no longer the watery, fermented fish sauce of the previous century. It was a substance that defied the simple rules of gravity. Heinz ketchup is what physicists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Specifically, it is a plastic fluid that possesses a yield stress. This means that when it is at rest, sitting in the bottle on the table, it acts like a solid. The molecular structure forms a 3-dimensional network that holds its shape. It refuses to flow. It will stay inside the glass forever, suspended in a state of stubborn equilibrium, unless a specific amount of force is applied to break the lattice. This is the source of the anticipation that became central to the brand's identity. The user has to initiate a physical interaction with the bottle. You have to shake it. This shaking applies shear stress to the fluid. When the stress exceeds the yield point, the ketchup undergoes a phenomenon called shear thinning. The viscosity drops instantly, and the solid turns into a liquid, allowing it to flow. But even the flow is engineered. The neck of the glass bottle was designed to act as a throttle. Heinz established a strict quality control metric for the speed of his product. In the factory, a sample of the ketchup was placed on a specialized ramp, a consistometer, and timed. If the ketchup flowed faster than 0.028 miles per hour, it was rejected. It was too thin. It was too watery. The product had to be slow. It had to exit the bottle with a deliberate, confident lethargy. This physics lesson also explains the ritual of the 57. In 1896, while riding a train in New York City, Henry Heinz saw an advertisement for a shoe company that boasted 21 styles. He was captivated by the specificity of the number. It felt scientific. It felt trustworthy. He began to count his own products. At the time, his company made over 60 different varieties of pickles, relishes, and sauces. But the number 60 felt round and hollow. He liked the number 7. It had a mystical, psychological weight. So, he combined the 5 and the 7. 57 varieties. It was a fabrication, a piece of marketing poetry that had no relation to the actual inventory. He ordered the slogan to be etched into the glass of the bottle, right on the neck, and, inadvertently, he placed the number on the precise structural weak point of the glass. Generations of diners would eventually discover that if you tap the glass firmly on the 57, you apply the exact amount of vibration needed to trigger the shear thinning effect. The solid becomes liquid, and the red paste releases from the vacuum, sliding slowly at exactly 0.028 miles per hour onto the plate. The glass bottle was not just a container, it was a machine, a device that required the user to understand the physics of the tomato in order to eat it. It was the final triumph of the industrial age over the natural world. A fruit that had been tamed, concentrated, and sealed in a transparent fortress, waiting for the precise moment of mechanical release. While Henry Heinz was busy perfecting the physics of the glass bottle in Pittsburgh, a different kind of industrial alchemy was taking place 300 miles to the east, in the gritty, smoke-filled manufacturing hub of Camden, New Jersey. Here, the challenge was not about purity or transparency, it was about weight. In the late 19th century, the Anderson and Campbell Preserve Company was a modest operation, canning the standard inventory of the era: peas, asparagus, and ready-to-serve soups. But the soup business was a logistical nightmare. Soup is, by definition, a liquid. It is mostly water. To ship a can of soup from New Jersey to a grocery store in California, the company had to pay for the steel of the large can, the wood of the crate, and the freight charges for the coal-burning trains that hauled it across the continent. Essentially, they were paying a premium to ship tap water across the country. The economics were brutal. A standard can of soup weighed 32 ounces and cost 30 cents, a significant sum for a working-class family. It was a luxury item, a heavy, inefficient cylinder of flavored water that sat on the shelf gathering dust. The company was bleeding money. They needed a solution that was not culinary, but mathematical. Enter John T. Dorrance. He was not a chef. He was a 24-year-old chemist with a pedigree that was almost comically overqualified for a canning factory. He had studied at MIT and earned a doctorate from the University of Göttingen in Germany. He arrived in Camden in 1897, not with a recipe book, but with a deep understanding of molecular bonds and thermal dynamics. He accepted a salary of $7.50 a week, provided he was given his own laboratory and total control over the production line. Dorrance looked at the tomato soup and saw a chemical inefficiency. He realized that the water in the soup was structurally unnecessary for transport. It was a filler that could be added by the end user at the point of consumption. If he could remove the water at the factory without destroying the delicate volatile compounds that gave the tomato its flavor, he could fundamentally alter the economics of the food industry. The process he developed was a feat of chemical engineering. Dorrance discovered that by cooking the tomatoes in a vacuum, he could lower the boiling point of the liquid. This allowed the water to evaporate rapidly without subjecting the tomato solids to the high, destructive temperatures that would turn the sugars into caramel and the acids into bitter compounds. He could reduce the volume of the soup by exactly half, turning the thin broth into a thick, concentrated sludge. This reduction changed everything. The standard 32-ounce can was replaced by a compact 10.5-ounce cylinder. This smaller can required less tin, less lead solder, and less paper for the label. It took up less space in the warehouse and less space in the boxcar. The freight costs plummeted. Dorrance calculated that he could sell this new, condensed soup, not for 30 cents, but for 10 cents. Suddenly, the tomato was no longer a luxury. It was cheaper than a pound of raw vegetables. The 10-cent can of Campbell's soup became the first true convenience food of the American century. But the genius of the invention was not just in the price, it was in the ritual. When a customer bought a can of condensed soup, they were purchasing a semi-finished industrial component. To eat it, they had to participate in the manufacturing process. The instructions on the label were a simple chemical formula: add 1 can of water, or, for a richer result, 1 can of milk. When the milk met the acidic tomato concentrate, there was a risk of curdling, a chemical reaction that had to be managed by constant stirring and heat control. The housewife was no longer just a cook. She was a laboratory assistant, reconstituting the dehydrated vision of John Dorrance in her own saucepan. The visual identity of this new product was just as engineered as the contents. A company executive, inspired by the uniforms of the Cornell University football team, suggested a new color scheme for the labels: a split design of bright red and stark white, centered by a gold medallion. It was a design of aggressive, modern simplicity. It popped off the shelf. When stacked in a pyramid, the red and white cans formed a wall of uniformity, a symbol of the standardized, mass-produced future. After that, the tomato no longer needed a vine in your back garden to be present in your meals. It could live in the cupboard as a label and a tin, waiting for heat and a saucepan. We have traced the tomato from the volcanic soil of Vesuvius to the copper kettles of the Heinz factory. We have seen it preserved in tin and suspended in glass, transformed from a perishable berry into a durable industrial unit. But to understand the final and most peculiar chapter of the tomato's chemical conquest, we must leave the surface of the earth entirely. We must ascend to an altitude of 35,000 feet into the pressurized aluminium tube of a commercial airliner. Here, in the artificial climate of the cabin, the rules of biology and chemistry are rewritten, and the tomato reveals a hidden power that went unnoticed for 5,000 years. The environment of a cruising aircraft is, biologically speaking, a hostile desert. The humidity in the cabin drops to less than 12%, which is drier than the sands of the Sahara or the valleys of the Atacama. The air pressure is maintained at the equivalent of an altitude of 8,000 feet, causing the gases in your body to expand and your blood oxygen levels to dip. In this state of physiological stress, your sensory apparatus begins to fail. The mucous membranes in your nose, which are essential for the olfactory reception of flavor, dry out completely. The constant droning roar of the jet engines, a white noise that averages 85 decibels, creates a phenomenon known as sonic suppression. It overloads the auditory cortex and, strangely, dampens the connection between the tongue and the brain. Studies by food scientists, specifically those working for the German airline Lufthansa, have mapped this degradation with precision. In 2010, baffled by the sheer volume of tomato juice consumed on their flights, they commissioned the Fraunhofer Institute for Building Physics to investigate. The scientists placed subjects in a decommissioned Airbus fuselage, lowered the pressure, and blasted the noise of engines. They discovered that under these conditions, the human perception of sweetness and saltiness drops by nearly 30%. The sugar in a dessert tastes like wax. The salt in a meal tastes like nothing. This is why airline food has a reputation for being bland. The food is chemically adequate, but the passenger's mouth is broken. But there is one specific taste receptor that is immune to this atmospheric interference. It is the receptor for umami, the fifth taste. Umami is the Japanese term for the savory, brothy sensation caused by glutamates. It is the taste of protein, of fermentation, and of deep, heavy satisfaction. While the receptors for sugar and salt go dormant in the thin air, the receptors for umami remain wide open. In fact, the data suggests that the background noise of the engines might actually amplify the perception of savory flavors, creating a craving for depth that does not exist on the ground. This is the secret weapon of the tomato. The tomato is a botanical bomb of glutamic acid. It is one of the richest natural sources of umami on the planet. And so, when the flight attendant pushes the metal cart down the aisle and offers a choice of beverages, a strange psychological shift occurs. Passengers who would never dream of drinking a glass of thick red vegetable juice at sea level suddenly find themselves asking for it. The statistics are staggering. Lufthansa alone serves nearly 2 million litres of tomato juice per year. It is the second most popular beverage in the sky, trailing only water and beer. When a passenger orders a tomato juice or a Bloody Mary mix, they are not just thirsty, they are unconsciously self-medicating their failing senses. They are reaching for the one fluid that possesses the chemical weight to cut through the sensory fog. The chemical resilience of the tomato in this environment is due to its molecular construction. Unlike the sucrose of an apple or the sodium of a pretzel, the glutamates in a tomato are stable. They stimulate the throat and the roof of the mouth, creating a mouth-watering sensation that counteracts the dry air. It is a form of hydration that feels substantial, a liquid that eats like a meal. In the plastic cup over the fold-down tray table, the tomato juice undergoes a transformation. The low pressure causes the volatile aromatic compounds to expand. The lack of competition from sweet and salty notes allows the earthy, metallic tang of the fruit to shine. It tastes richer, fresher, and more complex than it ever does at the dinner table. The tomato, once treated as a suspect nightshade, turns out to be oddly dependable in the air, where sweetness and salt go quiet and savory notes stay present. While the tomato was busy conquering the skies and the supermarkets of the West, cementing its status as the industrial king of the American diet, it was facing a much more stubborn siege on the other side of the world. In the vast, complex culinary landscape of the Indian subcontinent, the wolf peach had hit a wall. For nearly 4 centuries, the tomato sat on the borders of Indian cuisine, looking in, but unable to cross the threshold of the kitchen. This resistance is one of the great anomalies of food history. India is a culture that has historically absorbed foreign ingredients with remarkable speed. When the Portuguese brought the chili pepper to Goa in the 16th century, it was adopted so fast and so thoroughly that within a few decades, it was impossible to imagine an Indian curry without it. The chili pepper replaced the black pepper. It became indigenous in the blink of an eye. But the tomato, which arrived on the very same Portuguese ships, was left on the dock. The rejection was not based on the fear of poison, as it was in Europe. The Indian relationship with plants was defined by the ancient medical system of Ayurveda, which classified foods based on their effect on the body's humours. The resistance here was rooted in a concept far more difficult to overcome than toxicity: ritual purity. To the orthodox Hindus of the upper castes, the tomato was a foreign object. In the Hindi language, it was often referred to as vilayeti bengan, or the foreign eggplant. The word vilayeti carried a connotation of Britishness, of the colonial oppressor, and of something that did not belong to the sacred geography of the land. But the suspicion went deeper than politics. It was visual. The tomato was red. When you cut it, it bled a red juice that looked disturbingly like blood. For a population that adhered to strict vegetarianism, this visual rhyme was enough to classify the fruit as taboo. It was considered a heating food, a stimulant that inflamed the passions and disturbed the meditative mind. It fell into the same category as onions and garlic, ingredients that were forbidden in the sattvic diet of the Brahmins. So, for hundreds of years, the tomato remained a curiosity, grown only in the gardens of the British colonial officers. The Memsahibs would eat raw tomatoes in their salads, and the Indian cooks would serve them, but they would not eat them. The tomato was the food of the occupier. It would take a geopolitical catastrophe to break this taboo. In 1947, the British Empire finally collapsed, and the subcontinent was partitioned into India and Pakistan. The partition triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Millions of refugees crossed the new borders, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the recipes in their memories. Among these refugees was a man named Kundan Lal Gujral. Gujral was a restaurateur from Peshawar who fled to Delhi and opened a modest eatery called Moti Mahal. He brought with him the tandoor, the clay oven of the northwest frontier. He began selling tandoori chicken, a dish of marinated meat roasted in the intense dry heat of the clay pot. It was a sensation. But Gujral faced a logistical problem common to all restaurants: leftovers. The tandoori chicken that was cooked but not sold by the end of the night would dry out. By the next morning, the succulent meat was tough, stringy, and unsellable. Gujral could not afford to throw the meat away. He needed a way to rehydrate it, to soften the protein and make it palatable again. He needed a gravy. But traditional Indian gravies were based on onions and yogurt, which were expensive and spoiled quickly in the Delhi heat. So, he looked to the cheap, unwanted fruit that was piling up in the markets: the tomato. He created a sauce that was a masterpiece of chemical balancing. He took the acidic red pulp of the tomato and cooked it down with butter and cream. The acidity of the tomato cut through the heaviness of the dairy, while the fat of the butter rounded off the sharp, metallic tang of the fruit. He added fenugreek to mask the raw smell. He then tossed the dried-out leftover chicken into this simmering red bath. The meat absorbed the liquid, swelling back to life. This was the birth of Murg Makhani, or butter chicken. It was not a traditional dish, it was a recycling strategy, but the flavor was undeniable. The rich, red, creamy sauce bridged the gap between the foreign and the familiar. It was the dish that finally broke the resistance. Suddenly, the tomato was not a symbol of the British, it was the flavor of the new, independent India. The foreign eggplant had finally come home. Today, if you walk into any supermarket in the world, from the neon-lit aisles of Tokyo to the quiet corner stores of Toronto, you will find a monument to this victory. It is usually located right at the entrance of the produce section, a pyramid of perfect, bright red spheres. They are uniform in size, they are free of blemishes, they are firm to the touch, with a skin that feels more like polished wax than organic matter. This is the industrial tomato, the final evolutionary form of the Solanum lycopersicum. It is the single most popular fruit on the planet. Every year, the human race harvests 190 billion kilograms of tomatoes. That is a number so large it becomes abstract. It outweighs the global production of bananas, apples, and oranges combined. The plant that was once confined to a narrow, rocky strip of the Andes Mountains now covers millions of acres of the Earth's surface. It grows in the hydroponic glasshouses of the Netherlands, where the roots never touch the soil and are fed by computer-controlled drips of nutrient solution. It grows in the arid deserts of California, fed by aqueducts of stolen water. It grows in the orbital gardens of the International Space Station, orbiting the planet at 17,000 miles per hour. The wolf peach has not just survived, it has occupied the world. But this victory came at a steep sensory cost. To conquer the globe, the tomato had to make a compromise. It had to trade its soul for its skin. The tomatoes you see in the grocery store today are not the same fruit that Raffaele Esposito put on the Queen's pizza in 1889. They are the direct descendants of the green wrap. In the mid-20th century, agricultural scientists identified a specific genetic mutation called the ripening inhibitor. This gene prevents the tomato from turning soft when it turns red. It allows the fruit to be harvested by heavy machinery, dropped into a bin, bounced along a conveyor belt, and shipped across an ocean without bruising. It makes the tomato indestructible. But this mutation also turns off the production of sugar and volatile aromatics. This is why the modern supermarket tomato often tastes like nothing. It is a ghost. It is a red casing of cellulose and water, designed for logistics, not for pleasure. This has led to a strange bifurcation in our modern diet. On one side, we have the heirloom revival, a desperate attempt to claw back the flavors of the past. These are the ugly, lumpy, purple and green fruits that John Gerard would have recognized in 1597. They still smell of the vine. They rot within days. They demand to be eaten immediately. They are the luxury items, the rare glimpses of what the fruit used to be. And on the other side, we have the invisible tomato. This is the industrial paste that flows through the veins of the global food system. It is the silent foundation of modern caloric intake. It is in the barbecue sauce of Memphis and the bolognese of Emilia-Romagna. It is in the spicy jollof rice of West Africa and the chilled gazpacho of Andalusia. It connects cultures that have nothing else in common. We consume it without thinking. We eat it when we are in a rush, when we are tired, when we are broke. It is no longer a poison apple. It is the default setting of human hunger. The irony of this success is total. The plant that evolved toxins to stop animals from eating it has become the plant that animals cultivate on a planetary scale. It manipulated us. It used its bright red color to catch our eye, its hidden umami to hook our palate, and its genetic plasticity to fit into our crates and our cans. We thought we were taming the nightshade, breeding it to suit our needs. But in reality, the nightshade tamed us. It convinced us to clear the forests, to irrigate the deserts, and to build climate-controlled glass cathedrals, all to ensure the propagation of its seeds. We have become the pollinators. We carry the DNA of the solanum across oceans and borders more efficiently than any bird or tortoise ever could. It is a biological conquest so complete that we don't even notice we have been conquered. So, as we reach the end of this long, winding vine, let us look back at the strange path we have traveled. We began in the prehistoric Andes, with a bitter, toxic berry the size of a blueberry, protected by a chemical arsenal of alkaloids. We watched it travel north to the Aztecs, who ground it into the first salsa. We saw it cross the Atlantic in the hold of a Spanish galleon, only to be rejected by a continent terrified of witches and werewolves. We saw it blamed for the death of aristocrats who ate off lead plates. We saw it redeemed by the hunger of the Neapolitan poor, canned by the science of Spallanzani, and legalized by the Supreme Court of the United States. It is a story of fear transforming into familiarity. The thing we thought would kill us is now the thing that sustains us. The wolf peach did not change its nature. It simply waited for us to change ours. It waited for us to invent the tin can, the pizza oven, and the pressurized airplane cabin. It waited for us to get hungry enough to ignore the warnings of the herbalists. Tonight, the nightshade is no longer a threat. It is safe. It is resting in the jar in your pantry, in the bottle in your fridge, and in the garden outside your window. The wolf has been domesticated. It sleeps quietly in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise again. And now, it is time for you to do the same. Rest well. Good night.